Welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. I'm at S4 Conference with Munish Walther-Puri. And we're going to talk about a rating system for OT cybersecurity incidents called the Infrastructure Cyber Incident Scale, or INCI scale.
Yeah, that's right. You got it.
Beautiful. That was unveiled this week here in Tampa, kind of testing the waters.
Yeah.
And seeing what the audience kind of reaction was to it. Pleasure to meet you. Thanks for doing this.
Nice to meet you too. Thanks for having me.
So congratulations on the talk. I was in there yesterday. I'm sure you're relieved to get it done.
Yeah, there was a part of it where I was both relieved and excited to see what the reaction was.
Sure. So just before we get into the meat of the discussion, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself. You've got quite the resume. So
Thanks. I would say it's pretty weird and wandering, but it's brought me to this moment.
Sure.
My career started, I would say the things that are important about what I've done and where I've been, I always like to tell people it's really important that they know that I've been unemployed a bunch. You know, like the resume looks great in the rear view, but it's important to know that my journey has been like staccato and precarious at times, and I've been very fortunate to get to do some amazing work, sometimes in difficult environments. So that has taught me a lot about, you know, what kinds of environments I thrive in. What I would say about what I've done or what I've had the chance to do is think about risk, security, and intelligence in a lot of different domains. And nuclear policy and counterterrorism, fraud, geopolitical risk, supply chain risk, critical infrastructure. And that interdisciplinary approach has made it very difficult for me to look at a complex problem and not try and think transdisciplinary.
Okay.
And to say that a little more simply, I know that there are things that I can learn from other disciplines. I know that. It's up to me to then go find those disciplines, and sometimes I'm familiar with them, but lots of times it's driven by curiosity. Mm-hmm. My thought is always when I have an idea about, what about this? Someone else has thought of this.
Right.
Now I got to go find it. And then if I don't find them, and it's like, okay, I got to do this. But most of the time, you know, that's where I think about the real ideas come from.
Mm-hmm. So why take on this project? Is it a passion project? Did you see a gap? Obviously, there's a gap there.
Yeah. So I don't always have the best judgment about judgment about good things. This, you know, so to carry on, I couldn't find anyone who was doing this. That doesn't mean that they weren't out there. I just couldn't find them through my network and through research and otherwise. So I thought, well, there's a XKCD comic that is basically, if there's something doesn't exist on the internet, you need to go build it.
Okay.
So I took a little bit of that where it's like, okay, I'm going to go take a crack at this. Some of it was that the curiosity stayed with me, and I'll get underneath where that came from. But I say this to your listeners generally. If you have an idea that has anyone thought of this, sometimes people pursue it without checking. But if you check and no one has, then like pursue it. That
Sure.
this journey alone has opened so many things for me. Mm-hmm. And I have an important thing I want to share with you that someone told me about this on this podcast this morning. So I'll tell you about it a little later.
Okay.
All right. But so why I got into this. When I worked for the city of New York as director of cyber risk, I spent a good amount of time talking to people about cyber risk and cyber incidents without the cyber. And stripping that away gave it the core element of, is this categorically different from other kinds of risk that the city experiences? Other kinds of incidents? Short answer was yes and no. And I wanted to focus on the no.
Okay.
So the yes I knew, all right, technology and that, but what was the no? What was the part where it was the same as a hurricane?
Right.
Was it? And from one office, the Office of Emergency Management, it's an emergency. Full stop. So we're going to resource it. Can we resource it the same way as we resource other ones? That got into, well, how do they construe of it? Is it in the service of people who work in cybersecurity to get other people to think about cyber incidents differently or not?
Yeah.
Because we spend a lot of time going, cyber's different, it's so different. Actually, shouldn't we be like, this is the part that's different. This is the part that's not. Mm-hmm. And I went the other way. How does the city respond to things, or how does an emergency response respond to big events like a wildfire?
Right.
We often use the analogy sometimes of fires in cybersecurity, but I tried to stretch it. I was like, all right, how do they respond? How do the engines come in? How do they know how many engines should come in, which departments to call? What happens if there's a fire in their home zone? What if someone gets injured? Like, all these questions came from my mind, and I thought, they've got to have answered these questions. Short answer is they did. So that comparison continued. That was one. And the second is that when I would talk to people about preparing and preparedness and designing strategies for risk assessment and mitigation and what they could do left of boom, I would often use the analogy of a hurricane and an earthquake. They can cause similar amounts of damage. And let's say, hypothetically, you're in a place, and there are places on Earth like this, where the probability of those is the same, roughly. Say it's medium probability or even low probability, and impact is high, very high. So if you have that grid, they're in the same box. But no one would argue that you would prepare for those the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So wait a minute. What are we doing wrong here? We're not thinking about some of the other elements. So those two, thinking about weather and other natural disasters, got me thinking, all right, we know after, it takes a while. When you're in an incident, you don't know how bad it is.
Sure.
It takes a while after to figure out how bad it actually was. But can we tell, like, pretty close to the moment, how big and how bad this is going to be?
Yeah.
And so that's what really drove me to this.
Mm-hmm. And to me, just hearing you kind of take me through that, describe it that way, you're really speaking to on a level that, you know, you're speaking their audience, to their language,
right,
for example. And it's something that cybersecurity has always struggled with. Everybody wants to talk CVEs and complicated things like servers and patching. And you're talking about impact, you're talking about magnitude, you're talking about duration, all of these characteristics that make up, you know, the scale that you developed. And
I think the other part of it, that's right. The other part of it is that I would talk to my community who doesn't work in cybersecurity. A good part of my professional community, I make sure, doesn't work in cybersecurity.
Sure.
And they would come and say, how bad is this? Put this in some perspective for me. I heard about this thing. Is it worse than that? I would go, well, you know, and it's like, wow, I don't have precision around this.
Right.
And data breaches, I actually started applying this to data breaches first, and with a colleague tried to work out a little bit. Because those have some clear metrics. Number of records, types of data, you know, where is it newly exposed? There are 3 very easy metrics. And I thought about starting with that. But the reason I didn't, it's not that people don't care about data breaches. They don't know how to care. They don't know how to care about privacy. They don't know how to care about those things, generally speaking. People know how to care about disasters. And with critical infrastructure, there is smoke. There is fire. There is a potential for loss of life and limb. And so the urgency is really there. That's what else drove me to it. There of course, is a national security component. There's, you know, geopolitical elements. Like, there's a lot else there. But when it comes to the disaster and disaster recovery, disaster response, the other, I should say, I want to make sure to always give credit. There are a few other initiatives that I really saw. Wow, they're trying to connect these. One of them is ICS for ICS, which is founded by some really entrepreneurial, creative folks who are thinking about how do we plug in an incident response for industrial control systems into what already exists.
Right.
So not create something totally new, but the incident command structure for industrial control systems. So that was one, and there are a few other initiatives that I thought, all right, they're trying to plug into what already exists. How do I do that here?
And what exists that you can plug into? I mean, is there a gap there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought a lot about the colleagues that I worked with in the city and in CISA and DHS and others who understood the threat intelligence part of it. But then they were like, what do we do?
Yeah.
How do I respond to this? Is this, like, are we in emergency territory here?
Right.
Do we need to mobilize? And the idea of mobilization in cyber, you know, is only really an IR. But the recovery, all of that, I thought, I need some throttle for them. You and I know what it means if there's a Category 3 hurricane that jumps to a Category 5. We have some notional idea of what that means. I grew up in California, so I grew up with fires, unfortunately, and earthquakes.
And you know 5 is worse than 3.
I know 5 is worse than 3, and I know a 6.1 and a 6.8, that's a big difference.
Right.
So some of it came from my own personal bias, but in terms of plugging into, I thought, what is something that non-cyber technical people or non-cyber security folks, or executives at an enterprise or senior decision makers could understand that would bubble up from their people who were like, it's this. We're here. And that universality was a little bit intimidating, frankly, to be like, I'm going to try and I did start there. I thought, let me try and create a Richter scale for all technological disasters. And then I kind of dialed it in and was like, let me narrow the scope a little bit. But the idea that we have, I can say Richter scale, and everybody kind of knows what that is. Everyone knows what that is, even if they don't have personal experience with it, was really powerful.
Right.
And I thought, we need some kind of tool, and it's collective we need some kind of tool. If I can give this community something that will empower them with their stakeholders. So that's who do I really need to educate? It's journalists and media and public officials and emergency response. Right. It's not this group.
Right. That's a key point, too, because cybersecurity folks, especially with OT and ICS, they're talking to engineers. They're talking to asset operators, owners that aren't necessarily super in the weeds with security. And I think approaching it from that level is really smart. Taking that approach is really
I appreciate that. I will give credit to a nudge from Dale.
Sure.
At the S4 I spoke at 2 years ago in the closing session. And then last year, there were two things. 2 years ago, he said, engineering is not shy to learn from other disciplines. Why are we?
Right.
Essentially. Okay, good point. And then last year, and other years too, he's been about metrics, measurement. And I've been on the measurement train and quantification train for a while, but those two Phillips coming from him really coalesced this idea for me.
Is it harder to measure incidents in OT than IT?
That's an interesting question. I would say yes and no. I haven't dove as deep into thinking about IT. I would say with IT, what you have a bit more is outages, downtime, site reliability engineering, resiliency metrics, reliability metrics. So you have that uptime, downtime performance metrics. And in technology, we do think about the tech stack. And in OT, the Purdue model is the closest we've gotten to any kind of architecture that we can then all commonly reference. So that makes it a little more challenging because it's not necessarily the same blueprint that you use over and over. It's really just a rubric. However, the other piece that does make it easier, I should say more accessible to talk about incidents, is that safety is built in. There are a lot of ways that something can go wrong on a factory plant floor that can injure people.
Yeah.
And so safety is built into the culture in a way that is not in other parts of IT.
It's interesting that you looked at earthquakes, volcanoes as kind of like a jumping off point. Where did you see the correlation to security? Because, at first glance, you might not make that connection.
Right. I try to be forgiving of myself that my brain works in really weird ways. And I try and use it for the benefit of humanity. But genuinely, I say with humility, these are the worst things that have happened to people. How can I make the best of it?
Yeah.
So there are a couple things. One, I talked about how earlier it was a metaphor that I would use. But then a couple things happened. One, I became curious about when did we learn about tectonic plates? Because imagine the moment before we knew about tectonic plates.
Right.
The Earth would just shake randomly. And it was scary and unpredictable. And then I thought, now we have the Richter scale. And that Richter scale has been used to predict other things like that. So what is that journey? Because it feels like we're in the pre-earthquake time right now.
Yeah.
That's one. The second is also, I firmly believe, that we're in the moment before we had fire departments in cybersecurity. It's like if you can afford it, we'll get it. But then at some point we collectively said, and so I started to study the history of fire and fire response and organized fire response. And when did we go, we should all chip in and just have a standing group of people ready in case something bad happens.
Right. Versus
just volunteer or pay as you go. Pay as it burns, basically.
Yeah.
So how do I move that forward? Then there was an unimpeachable sense that these are bad things that are happening. And some part of it mattered if they were, created by some sort of circumstance, but some of it was just like, this is bad. And I felt that sometimes in cybersecurity, we focus a little bit too much on the threat. And like, oh, isn't that bad? Like, who did it? What are their intentions? I'm not saying that doesn't matter. But the consequence part of it, and the cyber consequence informed engineering also really oxygenated my thinking here. Like, yeah, let's focus on consequence. So let me peg to something that nobody would disagree is categorically bad. And let's talk about if we can measure how bad.
Right. Was it challenging in that we necessarily haven't had a lot of major OT, ICS cybersecurity incidents? I mean, there's a handful of
Great question.
malware samples that have
Great question.
been put in the public.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. I had maybe half a dozen.
Yeah.
Like when I first, just without looking at anything, I was like, all right, what are the top 5? That's what I asked myself.
Sure.
What are the top 5? What would I come up with? I could come up with 5. And then I was like, well, there's 6, 7. Like, let me argue. And I stretched my brain. I could come up with 10. And a little more research, it was
But
like
you can
15.
do that list. Like with IT, it's endless.
Yeah, exactly. And that was it. It was like count on 2 hands maybe.
Yeah.
And when I started to interview people who I really respect, who really know this, they even were like, yeah, these are the top 10.
Right.
You know? And the other piece was that the nature of those, and this is where the human factor comes in and the psychological component, we saw Stuxnet. We're not going to see another Stuxnet because we saw the first Stuxnet. Right? There's not going to be an exact another Viasat. So I tried to challenge that and go, well, every eruption is different. Every earthquake is different.
Yeah.
So let me try and find what's common. That's how I push back against that. The other part is I was very attentive to my own cognitive biases, working in a limited data set, recency bias, other heuristics that I knew were going to be there.
Sure.
So that's where I put in heavy into the research around incidents and tried to surface some that weren't as apparent. But I think that's the next part of this is really, really running through. But it's a great question. Yeah, I definitely struggled around that.
So tell me what goes into the incident classification part of this. I know you outlined a lot of it in the talk.
Yeah.
You even came up with kind of your first
right
output. So.
That was actually my second or third iteration,
okay.
What you saw there. And I say that with some pride because the Richter scale was not the first iteration. There were a lot of iterations before that, and there were other work that they built on, and there were other scales prior to that. So I'm very glad that I landed at a place that even I was able to push forth. So there are 2 things I will tell you before laying out the factors when someone's thinking about this massive scale. First, heavily emphasize communication. Every time I came up with a word, which came into my brain a lot, that already exists in cybersecurity, I did not permit myself to use it.
Yeah.
If it already had ownership in people's minds, I wouldn't use it. So severity is the one that comes to mind. I was like, nope.
That was the one I was thinking of.
Not using severity. And I'm going to try not to use impact. I'm trying not to use sophistication. Right? These already have ownership. So that was one. The second is, and this is there are a lot of commonalities I learned about the different measurements, but one of them was the logarithmic scale, multiple factors. I wanted that. And I wanted it to be like kind of calculable, not like you needed a lot of data. It was super complex. I wanted it to be relatively straightforward. So there are 3 factors. 2 of them are on a scale of 1 to 10, and the third one is a scale of 1 to 5. And then there's the log of those.
Right.
So the 3 factors are intensity, magnitude, duration. Intensity, magnitude, duration. Intensity is how deep the impact is. Magnitude is how broad, and duration is how long. That's very briefly how it goes. So the depth, it was interesting when I thought about earthquakes in my learning. One of the things I learned is that a development that happened along the way with the scales is the understanding that distance mattered from where the center of the shaking was.
Sure.
And we know that now, epicenter. But there's another one, hypocenter, that is depth from the surface of the earth. And that makes intuitive sense. if it's close to the surface, you'll feel it a lot more. If it's further down, and also if it's further down and there's bedrock, you won't feel it as strong, versus if there's sand or mud, then you'll really feel it.
Yeah.
So now I started to think, all right, it's not just about distance, and I'll explain what this means technologically, but it's not just about distance, but it's also about what's there. How much is it going to move?
Right.
Basically. So there it's about facilities, systems, users, like the depth of it. I thought about that core sampling kind of idea. And then breadth is organizationally, is it one system, one facility, does it stretch across different sectors and services? And so there is some overlap there, but it's really important. They're measuring different things.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at the same thing, but you're measuring it different ways.
Right.
So that's intensity, and then magnitude scale of 1 to 10. Here's the other thing. I really tried to stretch my imagination. Like some of the incidents we've seen were a 6 and a 7 on my scale.
Yeah.
I was trying not to define against, well, that's the worst we've seen. It's like, we're going to see worse.
There's room.
What does it look like? And so, at the end, I had to be like, global catastrophe.
Yeah.
Like, that's the worst one. And I looked at other scales. I was like, do they do that too? Do they imagine the worst? And in fact, some of the scales were revised a few times because they didn't stretch their imagination.
Right.
Because they were like, oh, there's compression at the top. There's not enough room for the really bad ones. Yeah. Whoa, okay. All right, I'm going to stretch.
That makes sense, though. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know how high the Richter scale goes, but I don't recall ever in my lifetime a 10, for example.
All right, perfect. Glad you brought this up. I looked at, for each of those, or I came across research that talked about, at each of the levels, how many earthquakes happen a year.
Okay.
And at the lower levels, it's like hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands.
Right.
That blew my mind. Because I was like, oh, that's what logarithmic means. And then the 7 to 8, it's a couple times a year.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ones we hear about.
Right.
Think about cyber incidents and intrusions. Like that kind of tracks.
Sure.
Right? That we're probably on the scale of hundreds, thousands, millions.
Yeah.
I know for some of the entities I worked for, it's been on the scale of hundreds, thousands alone for
every
an
day,
entity.
thousands of attempts anyway.
So, and then duration. This temporal piece has been really important to me always in sort of my development and thinking around forecasting and understanding risk. There it was how long until it's restored to normalcy, the OT environment. This is really OT specific.
Yeah.
Probably the most OT specific one, because I didn't want the environment overall. I wanted it to be just about that incident. And so it's, a few days, a few hours, a couple days, weeks, months, years. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's real rough.
Sure.
And that's intentional.
Yeah.
I wanted people to be able to get a sense pretty early. And some of the earlier scales, I also gave myself permission to make the first draft scale. Mm-hmm. Some of the early scales were that. They were like, I don't know, basically this.
Yeah.
Just to bucket what we're talking about.
I mean, it lines up. I mean, OT is all about safety, availability, and those are obviously huge factors. So
Right.
You talked a lot about during your presentation about the ability and the need to compare incidents. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So that goes back to your question, actually, which is a good one. What, there's a dearth of major incidents.
Yeah.
And we do this as humans generally when something new happens. We have the heuristic. Does this fit something that I already know?
Mm-hmm.
And for those of us in the field of security and risk and intelligence, we have refined that rubric. Is this something I've seen before? And when you're doing IR, that's the triage that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Does this look like something I've seen?
Right.
And hold aside the intrusion set or TTPs or anything like that, but just scale. Am I going to need to, is this going to be a week-long IR?
Sure.
Or are we going to need to bring in our retainers? Are we going to need to bring in resources? That comparison allows people to put it in categories and figure out what tiering of response they need.
Okay.
And this comes from emergency management.
Mm-hmm.
Just basic tiering.
Sure.
Military, national defense, all of them have this very basic tiering that when you're in that moment and you see the blast or you feel the blast, you can go, all right, this is going to be really bad.
Yeah. That makes sense. Like, have we tabletop something like this before?
Yes.
And then,
And that's the thing. If you have tabletoped, great. But if you haven't, are you going to have the benefit? How can you get the benefit of other people who have experienced this kind of thing?
Yeah.
So we had Shamoon, for example. And I talked to some people who worked on that.
Mm-hmm.
They now have the rubric and the mindset, and they've shared that information with us.
Yeah.
And so we can go, oh, all right, yeah, it looks like that wiper or whatever. But if you don't have that, how do you do that? So that benchmarking is really important. And then this is another deficiency of previous versions of scales that have been improved over time, is that they didn't account for geographical range. They didn't account for other variants in the way that these disasters manifested.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was really trying to, I wasn't going to achieve universality, but I was really trying to get something that covered all the different types of incidents. And I did that as a precursor. I created a very rough taxonomy of OT security incidents so that I could go, okay, does it fit that one? Does it fit that one? How do those compare? So Stuxnet and CrowdStrike, on one hand, you would never mention those in the same breath.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, maybe we should.
Yeah. All right, so that takes me to the next question. You put up, I think it was a top 10 or 12 kind of table of incidents, and then ultimately gave them a score. I think NotPetya was at the top, all the way down to Ultimar at the bottom in terms of less severe.
Good memory,
Yeah, exactly. Any surprises there for you? Were you kind of, I guess you have to fight that kind of bias. And
this is probably the one. I mean, Dale also was like, people are going to fight you on this.
Yeah.
You got to get this one
right.
He didn't say right, but he was like, be very thoughtful about this because people are going to want to argue this. And I thought, yeah, no, you're right. So I had lots of previous versions of that. This is me testing out the scale, frankly.
Yeah.
I tried a lot of different iterations of 1 to 10. I tried adding multipliers. I tried a lot of things. I talked to people about development of scales generally and did some research in development of scales, so I wasn't just guessing.
Sure.
But I was trying to get that right, and every time I would spit out the numbers. And I went with my gut a bunch of times before I went anyplace else. And I was like, that doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
That doesn't feel right to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, can I justify be like, that's above that? Does that feel right? And I'm okay to be surprised.
Yeah.
But that surprise has to yield something.
Mm-hmm.
And the surprise yielded confusion, and it's okay if it's followed by clarity, but it didn't. So it wasn't, I really had to work that. And I was trying to be like, oh no, am I reverse engineering this for my own bias? That's where showing it to other people was really helpful.
Sure.
And the exercise that I did, and if any of your listeners go watch the talk, they will hear me, and I invite them to do that before. They will hear me say, come up with your top 3 before I show you this.
Mm-hmm.
And not just 1, 2, 3, but maybe give them points. Maybe take 10 points and sign it across the 3. So number 1, that gets 5 points. And number 2, 3 points. Number 3, 2 points. Or number 1, 8 points. And 2 and 3, 1 point each. Like 1 was just far and away.
Yep.
Just a very rough sense of differential. That was the other thing that was important. I would say the surprises were that there were things that I wouldn't think next to each other in terms of they were very different magnitudes or different durations, but on this scale they ended up the same.
Okay.
So I thought, is this helpful? Like very genuinely, I was like, uh-oh. Is that helpful if someone's looking at this list and they see those 2 next to each other and those 2 are the same?
Right.
And I think that's the question I'm trying to prompt.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe we should be talking about those, or what happens if we put those next to each other, because they wouldn't otherwise end up next to each other.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's early days. This is the feedback you want.
Yes, exactly.
I will kind of fight you on one.
Please.
CrowdStrike.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a cyber incident. Obviously, an availability issue for a period of time for a lot of organizations. Why was it on there?
Yeah, great question. I don't have an answer that I love. I will tell you 2 reasons that I put it on there. 1, I will admit my own recency bias on that. It's the most recent large-scale incident that we had.
Yep.
And I really wanted to test it out. I was developing and thinking about the scale as that happened.
Yeah.
It represented a confluence of concentration risk and scale that we don't often see.
Right.
We saw it in Viasat around supply chain attacks, but we don't often see that. So that's one. And second, this idea that there's natural disasters and anthropogenic human-made disasters. So all technology would just be human-made, done. In a lot of taxonomies I've seen of incidents and disasters are like, oh, technology disasters all go in there. But we in cybersecurity, we go, wait, there's an outage, there's an accidental insider, like there's nuance there for us. CrowdStrike represented that nuance.
Yeah.
Where there is intent behind it, and you could argue this one was human-made. Humans that designed it and everything else. There wasn't malintent. That's the differential.
Yeah.
But for most people, I believe that they are going to think about CrowdStrike in the same way that they're going to think about Colonial, in the same way that they're going to think about NotPetya. This is a disaster of technology.
Yeah.
Now,
and it makes your comparison argument. I mean, we've got an outage. Is it CrowdStrike or is it something else?
where I'd like to see this go, and I'm almost afraid to say this out loud because it's like, oh my goodness, is instead of thinking about all technological disasters the same way, just in the same way that there's different types of natural disasters, there's different types of technological disasters.
Sure.
So there's technological earthquakes, there's technological volcanoes, there's technological tornadoes, there's technological tsunamis. Yeah.
That's your next generation
I
project.
know. That's why I was afraid to say it out loud, Mike.
All right, so last question. How do you make this practical? What's your ultimate measure of success for it?
Yeah, I think adoption.
Yeah.
But that's the ultimate one. So that people use something like this, or I inform some process for this work. And I'm going to measure that success, 3 ways. Number one, that people who are not working in critical infrastructure or OT security start to be curious and understand and have some comparison, ask some of the questions that you're asking about those incidents. That's number one. Number two, another indicator is that emergency response people demand. I want to increase the demand for this.
Yeah.
Yes, give me something that will help me triage so that I don't need you. Mm-hmm. I don't need you as a translator. I just need you to give me the number, and then I know I can fit it in with the others.
Sure.
And number three, and a year is probably too soon, but in 2 years at S4, I want to come back and I want people to say, yeah, we've been using it, or we've used something like that. Or the people that I work with, the engineers or counsel that I work with, or our incident response team, or the people that we retain for incident response, we started to use something like this, and it's helped me communicate to them.
That's huge.
Yeah.
All right. Great stuff.
Thank you so much, Mike. Great opportunity.
I'm ready. Thanks.